Gender discrimination is literally in the Bible. It transcends,
Yes, it is.
right? It transcends race and culture and geography and time, right? Like it's everywhere. Like pick your part of the world and it's there, right? And so I have no illusions about the enormity of the norms that we are trying to break that have been with us for a very, very long time.
Hello, dear friends. Welcome to the Let's Give a Damn podcast. I'm Nick Lapara, and on this show, I, along with my incredible guests, we explore what it looks like to live a meaningful life. Each one of my guests wants to leave the planet much better than they found it. Let's Give a Damn family, thank you for showing up. I'm so glad you're here. My guest today is the incredible Tchen. Tina is the president and CEO of Time's Up Now and the Time's Up Foundation. In 2017, Tina co-founded the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund, which has connected thousands of people with legal or PR support for sexual harassment across dozens of different industries. Before leading at Time's Up, Tina worked in the Obama White House for all 8 years as an assistant to President Barack Obama first, and then the executive director of the White House Council on Women and Girls and chief of staff to First Lady Michelle Obama. Tina did such an incredible job while working in the White House. Before leading at Time's Up and before her time in the White House, Tina was a lawyer that specialized in workplace culture, advising companies on gender inequity, sexual harassment, and diversity. Bottom line, Tina is an absolutely stunning human with whom I was so honored to spend an hour or so recording this conversation, and I can't wait for you to hear it. Before we begin, a quick reminder that you can anytime and for any reason email me at hello@letsgiveadamn.com, including if you just want to hear more about our guest or if you want to talk about last week's conversation, how we can get to COVID zero, anything. I'm ready to talk with you. I'd love to hear from you. And right now, let's get into my conversation with Tina Tchen. Let's go. Tina Tchen, it is an amazing privilege to have you on the Let's Give a Damn podcast. Welcome.
Oh, I'm delighted to be here.
Awesome. I am a huge fan of your work, and we'll get into what you're currently doing and how you got there right here in a minute. But I'd love to start by where did you come from? How did you get to where you are, right? So I'm always fascinated by the journey, right? Because so much of the things that happened to us, the things that didn't happen to us, the people that were around us growing up, right? They shape us. They point us in the right direction or the wrong direction. And we very reluctantly, make our way to where we are today, right? And so if you could take us back as far as you want to, I just love to hear about the people, the places, the thing, the who, what, when, where, and why of how you got here.
Well, happy to. I love that sort of like, where did you come from?
Yeah.
So I am the daughter of Chinese immigrants. My parents, Peter and Lily Tchen, came, right after they got married, sort of right in the Civil War that was happening in China, right after World War II. Fled that, came in really as refugees. I think it's important right now to acknowledge my parents weren't just immigrants, they were refugees, came in 1949, and were welcomed here. What a very different time it was. They were sort of celebrated. I have a clipping of the day my mother became a citizen when they were living in Ohio. And there was like a newspaper article celebrating the fact that she now became a citizen of the United States. But interestingly, my dad, when they got here, had learned from families and friends who were settled in the coasts that, there was discrimination they were experiencing in New York and California. And he attributed that potentially to the concentration of Chinese on the coasts. So he decided to take us to a place when he had kids where there were no Chinese. So I grew up in Ohio in the 50s and 60s. Born in Columbus and then raised outside of Cleveland, Ohio, in a predominantly Jewish neighborhood, suburb of Cleveland, really, in a time when there were maybe 8 Chinese families on the east side of Cleveland, and we knew them all. So it was an interesting time because I think what I now appreciate about that time is I just grew up being the only, right, and the other in the room from being a very young child. And I think that is sort of what steeled me to, in my later life, becoming a corporate litigator, where I was very much the only person of color and the only woman in the room, in lots of very high pressured situations. Uh, but I think I was kind of used to it because of that, what I just absorbed as a kid, and growing up, and doing that. So that's kind of the beginning part.
Yeah. So Ohio, right? Not big city. I mean, back then Columbus was, I mean, now Columbus is actually a cool place to be, right? But I'm not sure about in the, in the 50s and 60s. So like were there situations and circumstances? How did you feel being the child of refugee immigrants, growing up in that environment, going to school, friends, those conversations that were happening? How did that feel? What was going on back then?
Yeah, well, I mean, it was very much you were different. So, you know, um, really, my all of my schooling comes from Cleveland, right? So when I was 3, we moved, up to Cleveland, and I have vivid recollections of getting stared at in the grocery store, and pointed at, and questions about, where did you come from, and what's that about? And it was kind of like an issue when I got old enough to date. And a
Sure.
little bit more, remember, I grew up in a Jewish neighborhood, so it was a little less about being Chinese and much more about being a shiksa and then not being Jewish. So I experienced that, but it was pretty mild. I mean, it wasn't hostile, right? It was all more curiosity than anything else. I went on to, like, I was the president of all my, my classes, and then I was president of the student council, and so it wasn't, you know, I think I benefited from, quite frankly, being in a Jewish neighborhood that was very accepting,
Sure.
and pulled me in and taught me a lot about being active and and my parents were that way. My mother was, did the PTA and did, the Girl Scout troop leader, and was a real believer in being active in the community, and then got ill. She had rheumatoid arthritis for most of my childhood and adulthood, so became very ill. But even then, still, sort of her resilience is an example, that I think I absorbed as well. So, and I think, the anti-Asian, sort of, discrimination that has evolved now, I think it really wasn't as present in my childhood in the 50s and 60s. And I do think my dad was probably right, that being in a place where you weren't a threat and there was
Yep.
only a few of you and you could be more of a curiosity and not a threat, probably contributed to that.
Yeah. So at what point in your life did you leave this less, I wouldn't say non-threatening, but less threatening environment? And where did you go next?
Well, I went to undergrad, at Harvard.
Harvard. Yep.
Um, and then after that, got married and lived in Springfield, Illinois. In My ex-husband was from Illinois, which is how we got back there. And we both worked for state government in Springfield in 1978, which is the time that, just being in the right place at the right time. I had already gotten really interested in women's issues, feminist issues, did my, college senior thesis, in part on the women's movement, but landed then in 1978, right at the moment when Illinois was the hotbed of American feminism, oddly, but it was the focal point because Illinois was the only northern industrial state that had not ratified the ERA.
Oh, interesting.
And you may recall that the ERA had a time limit, supposedly. It had to get ratified by 1981. Had an extension. It was supposed to expire in 1978, got a 3-year extension to 1981. And they had 3 years to get 3 more states. And Illinois was seen as the linchpin because the other likely states, like Florida, were states in the South. And so everyone came to Springfield, Illinois, and I got very active in the National Organization for Women. We were doing marches. It was a very heady time for somebody in their 20s to be exposed to all of that, which was great and taught me a
Sure.
lot about organizing and doing that work. Learned a lot from Ellie Smeal, who was leading NOW at the time. And I think that shaped then a lot of the activism that I then sort of carried through. And then I went to law school in 1981, not mostly because that's the direction I'd always been pointing in. And to my surprise, found that I actually really liked being a lawyer, liked litigating, and liked doing it for big law firms. The pathway when you're in law school to go work for a big law firm is
Sure.
kind of easy. They're all recruiting on campus. It's the easy thing to do for your summers. And when I did the work in the summer, I kind of realized I actually kind of like this, and like it more than starting my career at a nonprofit, which I also spent a summer at, because I figured the learning I would get would be better. And the sort of adherence to what a client wants, because a client paying for you would be better. And so went to Skadden Arps, which is one of the top, now one of the top 10 largest firms in the world. At the time, it was kind of still an upstart and growing, based in New York, but had a Chicago office that had just opened. So I was like lawyer number 30, right, in an office
wow.
that's now about 250, which was great because I had an opportunity to, as a young lawyer, do a lot of things. And I loved it, and I stayed for 2 decades. So
Wow.
yeah, I've been there over 2 decades at the moment that President Obama asked me to leave and go to the White House. Probably that was the one job offer probably that would have taken me away from the
Naturally.
Right.
So let's back up a second. That is all like super fascinating. So by the time you get to, college, you're already, to use the language of my organization and what we're trying to get across, you're already giving a damn. Like, where did that start though? Did that start with being the child of immigrant refugees? What were some of the influences in your early life? And when did that start where you were independently on your own thinking, this is wrong, I need to do something about it? When did that sort of, form in your life?
Yeah, that is such an interesting question, Nick. And I'm not sure I've really paused to think about it. So I do, your parents, right, are obviously huge influences. So my mom, as I said, always, just from the moment we got to a place, got involved with, like I said, the local PTA.
Sure, yeah.
She was a room parent. She was my brownie troop leader. She, was doing things, with the city council in our little suburb. So much so that she got like a citizens award later on in life, right?
Oh,
because
cool.
of the things that she did. And so that was, you're looking by example when you're young at what is happening around you. My father, so interesting, my dad, he was an activist when he was in college in China, was very proud of it. Had a whole long story about how he, as a college student, sponsored this dance that was the cover for smuggling weapons to the resistance, the Chinese resistance,
wow.
which he was very, very proud of, and became, during the Vietnam War, very anti-war, which for someone in his position was a little unusual, and was very active as an anti-war activist. So I picked that up from him, so much so that when I was 12 years old in 1968, went to volunteer for the Eugene McCarthy campaign. That was my first campaign experience. My mother driving me to their little office that was in Old Town in Chicago, in Cleveland rather, to go sort of lick envelopes or whatever they would put a 12-year-old kid to do. So it's probably that, right? It's sort of being 12 years old in 1968, watching all the events of 1968, with a dad who was already kind of, anti-war. I remember I went through a period where I wore a black armband to school, to middle school. And it just sort of happened organically, right? In those experiences, and then that just sort of continued through to my doing student government. And then, I was a state officer actually in student council. There's a state, there's this national student council organization, and they have state affiliates, and I was an officer for that state affiliate. Interestingly, Steve Ricchetti, who's now one of, President-elect Biden's key advisors, was in the same organization, and we did not see each other or connect the dots until whatever that is, 40 years later, we meet up in the White House, in the Obama White House. So
that's fascinating. So yeah, so we're talking about, it's the thing that I love about your story, and the thing, as I think about my 3 little kids, one of my, I had a very interesting upbringing, with my parents and the way that they disciplined, and they've learned a lot over the years. I won't go deep into that right now. I've done so on many other podcasts, and we don't have the time today. But when I have my 3 kids, and people have asked, like, we have a 6 and a 7 and an 8-year-old. children. And I see my main role, like I don't see my role as a parent is not a disciplinarian. It's not to, always be telling them not to do this and not to do that, right? Which is it's an environment that I grew up in, But what I see my role as is to point them in the right direction, to point them in the direction of things that are good in the world, things that are happening, and for sure, show them the bad things as well. We've been doing a lot of that lately with, things, starting last summer with, BLM protests and stuff and all the horrific things that were happening, the things that we were fighting for and fighting against. And, leading up to the election, they were very active in conversations about why this is happening and what's happening. And then even just recently, conversations around the impeachment, right? So we don't hide those things, but we're, just seeing my role is like looking at the good things that are happening in the world, looking at the ways we can give a damn, and then pointing my kids and saying, what do you think about that? What do you think about that? And it sounds like your parents did a lot of that similar stuff. They were leading by example,
Right.
showing you what it means to give a damn in the world. How we don't wait around for other people to give us permission to give a damn, to make a difference. We just got to go do it, right?
Right.
I love that. I love that you were that in that you. But I want to point out as well that there were probably so many other kids that were observing those same things happening in culture, and they didn't do anything about it, right? So there is something unique about
Right.
your personality, and that's part your parents being an example, but also you could have ignored their example like so many kids
Right.
may have done, right? And so I don't want to move past that. I want to point that out because I think that's important. It's one of the reasons that I wanted to have you on. It's clear that your life has been consumed with, giving a damn in a variety of different ways. It's an important part of your story.
No, it's true, Nick. I mean, I do often, in the moments where I've like been too absorbed with one thing that was work, or, I was a single parent of young kids, there would be moments where it's like, oh, no, I have to go do this, right? You can't
Sure.
just, there are moments where different aspects of your life, some of them take up more time than others. And so whenever that kind of activism part kind of shrunk a little bit, it was like, oh, well, there's something missing, right? So I do have that kind of compulsion, for lack of a better word.
Yeah. Well, we share that for sure. And it gets us into trouble, right? There's just so
Right.
much to do. There's so much to do, and it's hard to focus, man. Okay, so 2 decades at this law firm, and then the next thing I want to get to is your time with the Obamas.
Mhm.
A family that I deeply admire for a bunch of different reasons. And you you were one of the, really, in the grand scheme of things, like one of the few people that got to work alongside them, over the course of their, tenure in the White House. How did that happen? And let's talk about that journey, because again, super fascinated by the family. Love the first lady, love how she did. What I love about Michelle is that she, in my mind, in my lifetime, the first ladies that I have seen, she did the most, right? She spoke out the most. She was the most active. She was clearly like supportive of what, Barack was doing, but also like, hey, these are the things that I'm going to go do. It seemed like there was, yeah, she obviously gives a damn as well. So talk about, how did that happen? How did you get involved in their campaign, and then ultimately, brought into the White House to serve alongside them?
Well, throughout my time, and going back obviously to even the 70s, as we talked about, my day job was a government, budget, officer, and I was taking days off to go protest and for the ERA, right? So I've always had that kind of what I call my extracurriculars, right? The day job, and then
Yep.
there's extracurriculars. So throughout my time, and especially the law firm, where then I had resources to actually be a bundler and a fundraiser, I was, always active on lots of not-for-profit awards and lots of political activity in Chicago. Was really big supporter of Harold Washington, did a lot of work with Mayor Washington and his campaign. Some of my dearest friends in life to this day come from working on, that campaign. And the women I met, we started something called Cook County Democratic Women back in 1983, and Janet Schakowsky actually is the product. Congresswoman Janet Schakowsky is one of the products of us promoting
Amazing.
women to run for office back in the 80s. So I always did that. And in the course of doing that work, long enough ago, the three of us have tried to remember, and we can't. Somewhere I met them. I don't have, like, Valerie has this cool story about how she met them when she was offering Michelle a job. I don't have that.
Yeah.
Somehow the three of us met, progressive, Democratic politics in a big city like Chicago is surprisingly small, right? It's a
Sure,
very
sure.
small town and everybody knows each other. So I was always a supporter then of his campaign, when he ran for Senate. And then obviously when he ran for president, very involved, on the finance committee. People think I worked for the campaign because I was always showing up in places. I did not. I was taking weekends off to go, do voter protection at every primary, took my kids right after Christmas to go work in Iowa, right, for the whole week leading up to that first Iowa caucus. It was fun. I mean, here's the thing. It was like a great inspirational moment. I remember saying to this kid, who was my boss in South Carolina when we were doing that work on South Carolina primary day. And he had just left his school in New Hampshire. After Iowa, he told his parents he was dropping, out that semester and drove to South Carolina. And I kind of wanted to say to him, which I did, it's like, there aren't many campaigns like this, right? I do a lot of campaigns and there are only a few that are that like a movement, right? And that is what we built in that campaign. And so then when it was over, I had a pretty happy life, Nick. My one oldest child was already in college. My youngest was 12 in a school that we loved with a job that I was happy with. So I wasn't really looking to uproot my family and move halfway across the country. But,
Sure.
If when the president calls and it's a job in the White House and it's working, on his outreach, that was the first job I had, was to run the Office of Public Engagement, which is the outreach office, which was kind of perfect for me. I had to resign from 10 not-for-profit boards in order to take the job.
God.
So reaching out to lots of different groups was kind of a natural for me. You do it. And then I wound up staying all 8 years, from inauguration day to inauguration day, which is kind of amazing journey to have.
That's fascinating. Do you know Michael Ware? So Michael worked, he worked on the faith side of things with President Obama.
He worked for Joshua.
Yes. Yep. He worked with Joshua Dubois. Yep.
Right.
Yeah. So Michael's a friend of mine. He was on the podcast a little while ago. So tell me about okay, you were there the full 8 years. What was it like though? Because again, this was a very first Black family, first Black president. Just so much vilification. This was obviously the time when, his birth certificate was being questioned. Like this was there were so many targets on Barack Obama's back all throughout, just people with just insane, just out to get him. Not really sure why. Overall, he is a fantastic human, and he was a fantastic president. What was it like working in that office though? Like, was it, I'm sure there was a lot of pressure to get things, because there was so many eyes, right, and ears on what was happening in that campaign. I would think more than usual. What was the pressure like working in that environment? Was it enjoyable, or was it like 50% enjoyable, but also 50% like, what the hell? Like, come on, this is insane.
Well, it is pretty insane. I often would tell people who would come to work for us that there's no job you could have held before the White House that prepares you for working in the White House.
Sure.
There really isn't. You could have been the CEO of something, you could have, been a military colonel, you could have done anything. And it still doesn't prepare you for the kind of scrutiny and pressure, and down to the junior levels, right? This isn't just something that's the senior staff experience, because you could be a junior person walking through the building with a bunch of papers under your arm that all of a sudden the title page is exposed and the press can get a picture of that, right? So this is not, and it is that level of detail that you have to pay attention to, right? How you're walking, where you're going, what you're carrying, in addition to the things that you're saying, because you are at every moment representing the president and the first lady of the United States. And to your point, we were very conscious, all of us, of the historic nature of his presidency and of that family being in the White House and of the attacks. I look at what the last 4 years have done, and the lack of care about the office and the image and the ethics. We were so careful about everything, because we did not want to give anyone, right, commit an unforced error that gave anyone, an opportunity to attack the Obamas in some way. And we felt that acutely as staff, that we really could not let them down at every moment, whether it's putting on a state dinner or sending Mrs. Obama out to give a speech, every going on a trip. I mean, the planning that goes into, people have no idea. People used to call me up and say, oh, she could just swing by like on her way to Nashville, right? For something that's kind of, you have no idea. Swinging by one place is 2 weeks worth of planning, sending an advance team out to scope the place and getting Social Secret Service clearance. That's the kind, when you do this right, that's the kind of planning that goes into what message you're trying to send, what people do you want to have there, make sure you're touching the right folks. Every bit of detail, there's no detail too small, and yet the platform is so huge, right? And that's the opportunity. I mean, in addition to being Mrs. Obama's chief of staff that I moved to after the public engagement, I was also all 8 years the executive director of the White House Council on Women and Girls. So with Valerie Jarrett, who was the chair, we sort of ran all the gender policy throughout the administration. And there were times when I'd read about an article in the New York Times on Sunday, right, about, women getting chained while they were having to give birth if they were in prison or something else. And I could fire off an email, and by Friday, get a policy response, from someplace in the federal government. I will never have a job like that.
Yeah, seriously.
Right? So the ability to make change and the impact is huge, and is amazing. And that opportunity, to be a part of that is very unique. So all of the pressure is kind of worth it, right? Because you are able to do those things.
Yeah. No, I imagine that it is overwhelmingly gratifying, no matter how hard it is, especially with that first family. I'm sure the enormity of the privilege that it is would overwhelm the pressure that you're under of literally having to watch how you walk in and out of buildings, which is insane. Let's take a moment right now, and we're gonna spend the last chunk of time on Time's Up, which is just a fascinating movement that I'm so excited to talk to you about. But we have a couple things to get to before then. One of them is this is as good of a time as ever to bring this up, and I don't really love talking about this, but I think it's important to talk about it with you. And that is, you were in the White House before this administration, which, for lack of more eloquent terms, has been a complete and utter shit show that has hurt so many people, places, and things, right? Like, I feel like the last 4 years has set us back so much. We didn't make any progress during these 4 years, right? In other words, like, so much progress was made during the 8 years. And I can look at past administrations. I'm left politically, but I can look at Republican administrations that I'm like, man, I completely disagree with so much that happened, but stuff happened, right? Like, we moved forward on this, that, and the other. I don't know that the list is going to be very, very short over the last 4 years. So being one of the, maybe the few hundred people that can, say they worked really closely in the White House to a president and to the first lady. How are you feeling? How are you processing? It's coming to an end, thank God. But how are you processing the last 4 years? Because again, I'm looking at it from the outside. I'm a civilian living in Nashville. Yes, I get to do a lot of cool things, but no, I've not worked inside of a White House. You know the inner workings. You know exactly when I see press secretary, come out of that back room, like, what all that looks like, right? You've been there, you experienced it for all 8 years. How are you processing through the last 4 years? How are you grieving? What are you excited about? Like, what's going on with Tina Tchen, just looking at what's been happening the last 4 years? Because my, oh my.
Well, it's interesting to sort of the just not sort of speaking personally, not as the Time's Up CEO.
Yes.
It was in the early days, we all of us who had come out of the White House, I think, tried to respect the usual rule of not commenting on your successor, right? And I have to say that the Bush administration was incredibly gracious. The transition with them was incredibly, smooth. They provided us with binders full of information, on things in the transition. They remained available to us. I mean, actually, Anita McBride, Mrs. Bush's chief of staff, is a good friend of mine now because I relied on her a lot, because there's so few people who've held that kind of job, that I relied on my predecessors, Melanne Verveer, who was, Secretary Clinton's chief of staff when she was first lady, and so I think we all kind of tried to do that. And then things started to unravel, and they started to unravel really quickly. And I remember I think my first vocal thing was in April of that year, when they started to take apart the adolescent girls education effort that we put together called Let Girls Learn.
Oh,
which,
wow.
of all the things I thought would survive, was global adolescent girls education, right? Not that controversial. We had built in 3 years worth of funding to sort of support it, and they started to dismantle it. And so I gave a comment, although I was still at that point being very cautious and not engaging in any personal. And I still haven't, Nick. I mean, I haven't been, totally vocal, but I did finally in this last campaign cycle, could not. I mean, this one was over the top for me, and I could not write something. So I wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post after the moment in which Trump used the White House as a campaign backdrop. I mean, to me, that was so horrifying, as a use of a building that is a pillar of our democracy, that I don't know how they twisted the legal rules to do it, but it really isn't. It's a violation of the Hatch Act. It is, but more than that, it is a violation of what the building is supposed to be. Yes. And so, at that point, I really wrote a very strongly worded op-ed, against that, because it's, like what happened, on January 6th. I mean, these are, institutions of our democracy that are supposed to work, whether you're Democrat or Republican. And the only way to do that is to make sure that what you do in the White House, you do as official and as president. And if you're going to do political, go down the street to your hotel, right? Or somewhere else. It's not like there is a shortage of venues, right, in Washington, D.C. to hold such an event. And, so I guess all of us have felt compelled at various points, and my colleagues who had been in the White House similarly, to get, more and more active. I will tell you, the one person who, when he started speaking out, I thought, ooh, we got a lot to worry about, is John Brennan. If you follow John, in his John Brennan, when I knew him as, Deputy National Security Advisor and then Director of the CIA, was buttoned up professional. I mean, man, there was one time we were working, and he's brilliant. He's fluent in Arabic. He is, and we were working on a speech, I remember, in the early years, to give to the American Muslim community that was beautiful. But he is straight arrow. So, like, we couldn't get him to speak publicly on things when we sort of thought his voice would be good. When he started speaking out with the directness that he has over the last 4 years about Wisconsin, that's what just led me to think, this is the guy who knows a lot about national security and can read behind or between the lines of what's going on. And if he's scared enough to be talking like this, we got problems.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I appreciate your being willing to share a couple things. I totally understand that. I'm not under that pressure. I don't advise that you go look at my Twitter feed, because I have been very, as vocal as I need to be, right, with everything that's been going on. But I appreciate you sharing. Like, I'm sure it is a struggle, and that's even interesting, because that this administration is not going to do that for the next, right? Those working in the administration, right? Like, this administration has broken down so many norms that should not be touched. Should not be. Everything feels so desecrated. Everything feels so, like, dirty. And I'm grateful that I believe the forthcoming administration will do the hard work of trying to restore trust in these buildings and these processes and this entity that is so important to. I mean, if I'm being completely vulnerable and honest, I'm not a big, like, I grew up overseas, came back here. I'm a very reluctant citizen of the United States, because I'm not enamored with it like so many other people are. But if we have any chance of being a successful experiment, we talk about the American experiment. If we have any chance of being a successful experiment, we have to have a few things that
Mhm.
don't that are rock solid. And this administration has gone after those few things, which leads to, the other day, on January 6th, a president not outrightly saying go storm the Capitol, but basically saying go storm the Capitol, and then we saw what ensued. That's just wild that is the act that's where we're at. And I'm grateful for the previous administration. I'm already grateful for the forthcoming administration. I just hope that we can like find some normalcy here in the next few years. I
Yep.
hope so. So let's move on to, so you leave the Obama administration, and in 2017 you go back to
Law
doing
practice.
law, right? Law practice.
Right. So I went
And
back to a law practice and actually started. So I went to the Buckley Law Firm, which is a Skadden spinoff. And actually, the folks there were really great and allowed me to start a new practice. Like it wasn't something that anybody was doing, and it was a practice on workplace culture. Now, this is pre-Harvey, right? So it's workplace culture because I had seen one of the initiatives we had in the Obama administration under the Council on Women and Girls was a working families agenda, because we could see you needed things like paid leave and flexible scheduling and equal pay, because companies needed women to succeed in the workforce if they were going to attract talent and succeed. So we had a working families summit in the White House. And one of the things I learned in talking to companies who wanted to step up was that they didn't know how to do it. They didn't know what to do. Their lawyers were frequently telling them, don't do an equal pay study because we don't want to find out bad evidence.
Sure.
So you don't make change. And so I thought, a legal practice where you actually are advising people on how to make change would help. I literally got there around Labor Day, launched this practice in late September, which was about 3 weeks before the first Harvey Weinstein article. So, I had to launch this. I was pretty convinced of its need, but there was a couple of weeks where it was like, okay, is it or not? And then the Harvey thing happens. And of course it exploded and the practice became very successful. But the Harvey moment is also when I just happened to be out in LA right after the articles, and to work actually on another project that Valerie and I do, which is the United State of Women, which is our continuation of the women and girls work from the Obama administration, and happened to be pulled into a meeting then that of the women who were working on what would become Time's Up, which really just started as women of Hollywood after the exposure of what happened with Harvey. So many women who had been keeping things internal, thinking they were the only one, because that is the playbook of how sexual harassment has allowed to persist, realized they weren't alone and started speaking out and coming together and using Toronto Burke's hashtag #MeToo. That propelled it. But they were really, to their credit, already thinking beyond their personal pain and on what could they do, right, to respond to this, and how could they do it for women outside their industry, and how could they do it for low-wage women. And that was also propelled by this beautiful letter, from the farm worker women, spearheaded by Monica Ramirez, that appeared in the New York Times, of these farm worker women saying, we see you. It could have been like, what do you mean, you women of privilege? Instead, it was a beautiful outreach of low-wage women to women of privilege saying, we understand your pain and we share it. And that elicited a response from the Hollywood women of, we need to do something that actually reaches those women. And hence was the development of both Time's Up as a brand and a movement, and then our first initiative as the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund, which, we launched January 1, so it's just about just been past the 3-year anniversary, sort of hailed on the Golden Globes red carpet, generated $24 million right away. Like, I think one of the most successful fundraising drives GoFundMe has seen. 100% of that 24 million went to the Legal Defense Fund, which is housed at the National Women's Law Center, and has now reached, over 5,000 individuals who come forward for either legal assistance or PR assistance. And then over the course of 2018 sort of led to deciding we actually also needed an advocacy organization, not just the Legal Defense Fund, that these problems were persistent. We needed to work for survivor justice as advocates, but we also needed to work for a world where it doesn't happen in the first place. We don't want to only just be picking up the pieces afterwards.
Yeah.
We need to create workplaces where it doesn't happen in the first place. So that is our broader mission now, is to work for safe, fair, and dignified work for all, right? So that sexual harassment doesn't happen in the first place while we continue to stand for survivor justice.
So that's what I want to get after is we need to, it's good that it is, in fact, it's more than good. It's amazing that women, primarily women, feel more welcome than ever to speak out. They're not afraid anymore. That's fantastic. But what we've got to get to is a world where that doesn't happen in the first place, right? It was accepted for so long. Too many people turned their eye gaze. They looked away. They walked away when things were happening. And we've got to change that narrative altogether. And we've got to make sure that, I have 2 daughters. I don't want, if anything ever happens to them, God forbid, I want them, they will feel, we're going to help them feel super comfortable to speak out, and we'll help them and all that stuff. But the point is, I want them growing up in a world where that would never happen to them. Right? So how do we do that? You're the expert here. How do we need to make that shift. This is the generation to make it happen. Again, we've got energy on our side. We've got social media on our side. We've got people ready to go to work and to fight for this on our side. But how do we tangibly, how does that happen? Where does this conversation begin after it's been, these things blow up online and we raise money and we start advocacy groups and all that. And I had our mutual friend Gretchen Carlson on the podcast a few weeks ago. She's a hero, amazing. And we talked a little bit about this, but how do we, she's obviously been a big part of this conversation the last, couple of years.
Yes.
How do we do this, Tina? How do we get this started? If anybody's listening and is like, well, I know this is happening, or they're just on board with like, if I ever see it happening, I want to make sure it doesn't happen. How do we get this conversation going more and more so that it literally cannot exist? Because it still does, right? Like you guys are doing incredible work, but it's it's still out there.
Well, it still does, and COVID actually has exacerbated it, as it has exacerbated and revealed so many other fissures in our economy and in our society. We participated in a poll that One Fair Wage just released just before the holidays that shows that 40% of restaurant workers have seen this increase in sexual harassment. Things like, pull down your mask so I can see what you look like so you can get a tip, or pull down your mask so I can stick my tongue in your mouth. I mean, those are quotes that restaurant workers they're experiencing during the pandemic when they have to work. So yeah, I mean, it is definitely out there. We released a report from the Times Up Legal Defense Fund and the National Women's Law Center that shows even still, 7 out of 10 of the folks who come to us for help have experienced retaliation for coming forward. So, we are a long way from even the idea that if you are experiencing it, that you feel you can safely speak out. But that's the starting point. So one of the starting points is making sure that the policies in your company, in the places where you work, have things that aren't, part of the problem was everybody had a policy on sexual harassment for the last 30 years because it's been illegal.
Yeah, it's law. It's right. Yeah, it's in the law.
Illegal for 30 years. But everybody wrote their policy to the legal minimum. And the standard for bad behavior under the law is really low, right? And I keep telling companies, you don't have to adhere to that low level, right? This is one of those things the lawyers will tell you, don't take on more than you need to, except that if you're a company, you actually want your employees to be held themselves to a higher. You don't want bullying to happen in your environment. You don't want, here's a great example, under the federal law, bystanders who speak out for their coworker aren't necessarily protected from being retaliated against. But I say to companies, don't you want people to support each other? Don't you want to know about it? So you should protect the bystanders. Yes, it might get you the 1 or 2 if a bystander is mistreated, a lawsuit from a bystander that you wouldn't get because you've put it in policy. But isn't that worth setting a better tone and culture for your company? And I will say that since 2017, right, since Harvey Weinstein, more and more companies have done that. Like, most big companies have revised their sexual harassment policies to do things like provide multiple avenues for people to report. Like, you don't have to go to your manager, but your manager who's harassing you, right? and expanded the definition of, behavior that will not be accepted.
Hmm.
Because we really have to address the root cause then is toxic workplaces. So that's one category. The stuff that Gretchen's been doing on eliminating the use of NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, and
Yep.
mandatory arbitration, for example, all of the things that were used to keep things secret. But then we actually have to sort of get at the root cause, and the root cause is the power imbalance, in workplaces, where white males are at the top, women and people of color and LGBTQ and disabled workers can't succeed. The actual outright discrimination that occurs, but also the subtle things, sort of the microaggressions, the things that don't look like comments that don't look like they're sexualized and yet are incredibly demeaning and are used to put people in their place. And we know it's happening over Zoom. We know, whatever's happening in the chat room that you don't see as a manager, or how people can get talked over, how people aren't even invited to the meeting that they would have been invited to otherwise. And so, we really need to get at that toxic workplace culture. We need more representation up and down the wage scale, because if you have more people of color, women, disabled workers in the leadership, they understand these issues and it doesn't happen, and it creates a different culture overall. And here's the other secret sauce here, Nick, is that it's profitable for companies, right? It gives you access to better talent in a globally competitive market. We are the only, industrialized country that does not have a national paid leave policy or even sick leave. And had we had that at the start of the pandemic, think how much better off we would have been, and think how much individual companies would have been, because they would have already had sick leave in their business plan. Instead, we had to shove in some emergency sick leave that was not adequate, left 130 million workers uncovered. And the package, the $600 package that just passed, is insufficient, left that out. So I'm hopeful that the package that the Biden-Harris administration is putting together will have that back in. So, all of those things need to get addressed that are barriers to women succeeding. So it's the lack of paid leave, the lack of caregiving, the lack of fair pay and promotion practices, the lack of equal pay. All of those issues are issues for us at Time's Up. And I will say the most urgent one that we and a lot of our, partners throughout the sort of movement will be working on in the really immediate futures. I believe we're in a fourth crisis, right? So we have a health crisis, an economic crisis, a racial justice crisis, and we are now confronting a caregiving crisis, right? Because, women, over 2 million women have left the workforce since February of last year. We are at, women's labor force participation is at its lowest level since the 1980s. And a lot of it is caregiving. It is because schools aren't open. They've got school-age kids. They've got older family members who might be ill. They've got self-care issues. Even employers, I've been watching the Wall Street Journal, and they now have had a series of articles that have talked about the fact that employers recognize they can't staff their manufacturing shifts because their workers have caregiving responsibilities. So employers understand this is an issue. So we really need a national caregiving infrastructure policies that address both childcare and school-age care and elder care. We have a system in this United States that actually, in Medicare, over incentivizes putting somebody in a nursing home versus keeping them at home, which not only is more expensive, puts them at risk, as we now know, 100%. Right, to COVID. But that's the way the money flows, because of the nursing care home lobby. So we need to address all of those things and have a comprehensive, holistic approach to caregiving. We're calling for it. I give credit to the Biden-Harris administration, because in the campaign, they actually had a very robust plan that was comprehensive in their campaign plans, which I'm optimistic, and knowing the Biden team well, I'm pretty sure they're gonna keep their campaign promise and address this, and it's job creating, right? It is the way to restore our economy, but restore it in a more sustainable basis, not just short term, not just fast cash. I mean, I want those $2,000 checks to go out, but that's not rebuilding structure.
No, it's
right?
not.
We need to, in addition to immediate cash in your hand, Also rebuild structures that will allow workers to be able to go back to work with more support on a long-term basis, create caregiving jobs that are good, that are in the formal economy with a fair wage and labor protections. Right now, most of caregiving is in the informal economy where people are abused and they're paid atrocious wages and there's no recourse. But the way to solve the sort of supply and demand mismatch we have right now in caregiving is to grow more caregivers by making the jobs better, right? And creating a career path for that. So that's part of the agenda as well. So we will, it's very much a priority for, for Time's Up, for all of the folks who work with us, and for, we're working with people like the National Domestic Workers Alliance and Caring Across Generations, a whole coalition of folks, to really, make this a, just shift how we think about caregiving in this country. That we see it as an infrastructure need, not just as something you're supposed to figure out yourself when you're working.
This issue of caregiving has really come to light. I mean, just it's in the spotlight because of this pandemic, right? And I've had two conversations recently that really speak to what you just described and what we're talking about. One with Annie Lowrey, who writes for The Atlantic. She wrote a book called Give People Money. And it's her argument for a universal basic income, which I'm highly in favor of. And one of the things she talks about in our conversation is how maybe a full UBI is what's coming and what's needed, right? But what we should definitely have, and it's wild that we don't have, is a UBI for at least the children, right? Like, children are suffering because adults are shitty at their job, right? That's what's happening right now. Adults in the government, like their parents, maybe even, like, I'm not saying that there aren't circumstances but kids are suffering because the adults can't figure out how to make this work, both from the government all the way down, right? And that's atrocious, right? That kids, there's so many, I was talking the other conversation with Reshma Sojani from Girls Who Code, amazing human. And she's introducing this idea of exactly what you just described. Like, we should be paying women they're everything right now, even more than before. They are now, on top of other responsibilities they had before, they are now teachers. Maybe glorified IT people is more it, which is my amazing wife in our home right now. She's ITing for our 3 kids, right? Running on laptops, making sure the internet's connected. But it's tragic that in 2021, we are still so far behind on these issues, right? Way too many, like, white men still get most of the board seats and the CEO positions and the everything, right? And women and people of color and our LGBTQ friends and disabled friends, and they get left to the wayside. Like, how is that possible in 2021 with all the data, all the information? It's truly wild. So that makes the work that you all are doing even more incredible, because I think I think you all are doing a fantastic job. The idea obviously is resonating with people. I mean, I love these punchy ideas, right? That's why I started Let's Give a Damn. Right now, I'm working on a COVID zero project with a renowned physicist, Yanir Bar-Yam, and Time's Up says it all. Right? Like, there's we're not being soft here. We're not even letting you guess what we're about. It's over. It's done. We're not going to allow it anymore. Things have to change. They must. Let's go. Right? Like, that's what I get when I see Time's Up now.
Good. Well, that's good. Good. You're getting it. That's what it is. But here's the thing. I mean, and I'm kind of realistic about this, Nick, is that I often say, gender discrimination has been with us for forever.
Yep.
This is not like an artifact of the New Deal or something like that. Gender discrimination is literally in the Bible. It transcends.
Yes, it is.
Right? It transcends race and culture and geography and time, right? Like, it's everywhere. Like, pick your part of the world and it's there, right? And so I have no illusions about the enormity of the norms that we are trying to break, that have been with us for a very, very long time. But you said a while back, this generation, is the one that can do it. And I am optimistic. I mean, I think Millennials, don't stand for it. They vote with their feet on jobs. Like they do things like the Google walkout. They,
Yep.
are voting using their pocketbook, right, to make decisions. And companies are paying attention, and I think that's starting to break things down. What happened this summer was amazing in terms of the willingness of folks to get out and march in the streets and make your voices heard. And it's being heard in corporate boardrooms. You can see the changes starting to happen. But we just need to keep at it. And we need really, as I said, to rethink the structures that we have in our economy, because my one thing about UBI is we can give them money, but if we don't create a structure, for example, now that you have the money to purchase care, if the care isn't there, right? If the
100%.
job structure isn't there, if the daycare center isn't there because it just closed because of COVID, right? Or your employer isn't providing employer-based care, care that you can go and get, then UBI only gets you so far. And so we've got to actually reform these structures. So that's what this caregiving piece is about. It's not just daycare centers, it's paid leave and flexible scheduling, because those are all the things that allow a worker to address these issues and hold a good job, and progress, and for companies to have a part in this. So this is not just public policy. And companies are seeing it in COVID, right? We got companies who are now for the first time using the empty space that they have to open a childcare center on site, or are giving their workers additional stipends, to purchase childcare, are helping their workers with buying Khan Academy or something else to help supplement, right, the schooling at home that they're doing. It's a great moment. This horribleness of this crisis is giving us at least a window into a possibility of a transformational change. Literally, I think we could affect a very big transformational change in how we think about these things. So that's why I'm excited. It's why I took the job last November, left my law practice, was even before COVID, because of everything that was happening since Harvey Weinstein, I thought we were in a transformational moment. COVID has only accelerated that, because it has now exposed all of these problems that we all knew, women knew, but now all of a sudden everybody knows, right? And has seen how terrible, the situation is for workers. And I do think there's a new willingness. We did a survey that was just released around the holidays that showed that, 9 out of 10 Democrats, but even 8 out of 10 Republicans support a holistic, comprehensive caregiving solution.
Wow.
So this is, we have a moment where there's true bipartisan support for doing these issues, because everyone is experiencing it. Even if you're wealthy, right?
100%.
For the first time, you're experiencing it, right? Because your kids are at home, you've been quarantined from your nanny, now you've got to deal with it, right? And so it's a very unusual moment where men and women and rich and poor are actually all experiencing the same stresses, and that has, I think, given us an opportunity to really address these issues.
Yeah, fascinating. I could talk to you for hours. Let's wrap up with this question, though. So, hypothetical scenario, I come up to you, Tina, and I say, Tina, I believe in you, and I'm going to give you, I just purchased a billboard in every town and city in this country for you. And you get to put something on that billboard, something that can speak to, let's keep it to America for now. Even though this is a global problem, you can speak to every American via that billboard. What would you put on that billboard? This is your thing that you want to communicate to everyone right now.
Well, I think it's some version. I'm not really good at doing things really short, but it's
no, that's fine.
Because I'm a lawyer, right? But it is some version of sort of time's up on, discrimination, and it's time for safe, fair, and dignified work for everyone. And then I would be remiss if I didn't say, and if you want to join us, text now, the word now, to 30644 to get more information about Time's Up and to sort of be part of this movement.
I love that. That's a great billboard. Time's up on this discrimination, and it's time for fairness, equality. And I will definitely, all things Tina Tchen and Time's Up will be linked to in the show notes. Tina, I think the world of you. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Oh, my pleasure, Nick. It was fun. Thank you.
Dear friends, thanks so much for joining Tina and me today. Go follow Time's Up on social media at Time's Up Now on all social media platforms. And follow Tina at Tina Tchen. That's Tina, Tchen, on all social media platforms. Visit letsgiveadamn.com to learn more about what we're up to at Let's Give a Damn. Tina, thank you so much for joining us. And friends, I'm so glad you're here. So grateful. Thank you for showing up. This episode was edited and sound designed by the team at Sound On Studios. You can find out more about their work at soundonsoundoff.com. The music is by our friend Propaganda. You can reach out anytime and for any reason at hello@letsgiveadamn.com. I'd love to hear from you. Be safe. Keep giving a damn. Bye for now.